But to begin with today, it's been a busy week in Canadian politics, of course, with some rather controversial legislation passed by the Ontario government and the Prime Minister weighing in on a couple of different issues, including health care. And let's go over a number of the key issues. And to do that, of course, it's time for our weekly political segment with John Best, who is the publisher of the Bay Observer. John, welcome to Friday. Glad you could be with us again today.
Nice to be with you, Bill.
Let's start off with the More Beds, Better Care Act. That's what the government is calling this. Others are calling it the controversial long-term care bill. But it passed. It's with a majority government, of course. That was inevitable. We know there's a health care crisis. The Prime Minister and the Premier, as you know, John, met earlier this week and talked about this, and they came to an agreement that, yes, something has to be done. Is this the best way to do it, though? Is this the best way to attack this problem?
Well, I'm not qualified to say to talk about the methodology, but the more I read the information on this bill, it seems more and more like it's kind of window dressing. It's they've taken away some of what we thought were going to be the key elements. Number one, it turns out the hospitals cannot forcibly evict somebody. So it's still going to be, I guess you'd call it coercive voluntary. And the other thing, Ford, I think yesterday said that there was this discussion about patients being billed $1,500 or $1,800 a day, and he described that as ridiculous, and said he'd be talking to the hospitals about that. So, we'll see what happens the first time this thing gets tested, but some of the teeth have been pulled on it already, and what it really boils down to is we really, really want you people to leave. That seems to be kind of what the bill is doing right now.
Yeah, that seems to be the mindset. You hear some of the terminology that both Minister Calandra and the Premier were saying. These are people taking up beds. They're in the hospital for a reason. I mean, if they weren't ill in some way, shape, or form, I mean, they'd be home. So there's that. And the other thing, because I've heard from a lot of people, as you have, I'm sure, over the last 7 or 8 days, and they say, what do they mean by into a long-term care facility? Are they talking about independent living? Are they talking about assisted living? Are they talking about chronic care wards? They weren't very specific about that, and maybe it's because they don't know.
Well, and what we do know is that there is a chronic shortage of all of those facilities. So it's not like there's various long-term care homes with all these vacant beds just waiting to get these people out of hospitals and put them in. And again, as we've talked about before, it's not a question of a bed. You can get a bed at IKEA. The issue is staffing. And, it would appear that part of the intent of this bill is essentially to shift, the capacity is now being shifted to the long-term care sector. Bill, I'm not aware of there being surplus capacity in the long-term care sector. I think they're suffering as badly or worse of the staffing shortages.
Well, because we've talked about this in numerous other times, because let's face it, long-term care facilities have been in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons for the last 3 or 4 years, and probably should have been for longer than that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, in one breath, they say, well, there are long wait times for these long-term care facilities, but we're going to find spaces. Well, I just want to extrapolate something for that, John. If you've got a place that's got vacancies, it's probably because it's not a very good place and nobody wants to go there. And there's got to be some reasons for that, whether it's staffing, whether it's the facility itself, I don't know. The places with the waiting lists are the ones that probably offer the best care, and that would be their choice. So, no, we're going to send you someplace that has substandard care and because there's more beds there. Is that really the solution here?
Well, it doesn't sound like it, Bill. Again, it's beyond my area of expertise, but just listening to the language around this whole exercise, it really seems to me to be more of enhanced persuasion than anything with any real legislative teeth to it. The idea of people being hauled out of hospitals, put in, ambulances or DARTS buses and then taken against their will to long-term care or nursing homes, the visual specter of that would just be deadly, I think, for any government. So there's got to be a play here that we're. I think the bottom line, Bill, it's like so many things. There's something going on here, and we don't quite have all the detail. I'm guessing that this whole piece of legislation was at the behest of the hospital community. They want to move this. There was kind of a wishy-washy statement on the Ontario Hospital website, Ontario Hospital Association website, that if you read it, you're not really sure whether they were referring to this bill or not, but it appears they are. So, I'm sure they want to keep their head down as much as possible. But it's the, all of these various branches of the healthcare system are understaffed at present and shifting people around. I mean, the notion, should we get people that don't need hospital and intense hospital care, should they be somewhere else? The answer is absolutely yes, because what happens at the other end is you got people sitting in the emergency room, waiting rooms, who really, really need a bed and can't get it. So, there's very good reason for wanting to move the people out of the hospital. The issue is there really a place for them to go? And I'm not sure about that.
Well, that's the concern. I know that Samir Sinha is the director of geriatrics at Sinai Hospital. It's part of the University Health Network, the group of hospitals in the Toronto area. Says he's worried that hospitals are going to focus on using this power to ease the capacity burdens that they're facing rather than putting a priority on the well-being of patients. And he says he and a number of his colleagues will be taking extra caution now when signing off on discharge papers for fear that their patient may be sent away to someplace far away from where their caregivers are. So that's a key element of this that they didn't much talk about. What if the doctor doesn't sign off on this? And I understand you're totally right about the burden on hospitals, and you're absolutely right. There are people there that probably should be in other facilities, but there's not enough room in those facilities. And didn't we just have a discussion a couple of months ago about the staff shortages in long-term care facilities too? So I guess the question here is, are they just kicking this down the road, or is this a shell game? We're going to move the problem over here.
Well, if indeed it does succeed in moving the problem, I mean, these doctors that aren't going to sign the discharge things, I mean, they never lose. They're not responsible for the system. They just bill it. And so, the fact that they're in revolt is probably predictable. But, there's a problem here. We're trying to solve it at the government level, and probably that's the first part of the problem. What was interesting in the conversation between Trudeau and Doug Ford this week is both of them came out of the meeting saying, we just, it can't be the status quo plus more money. There needs to be a fundamental change. So I think we're sort of getting the tip of the iceberg here, but it appears that the feds and the provinces are starting to come to some sense that there will be more money, but it's just not going to be more money on top of the status quo. There's got to be some sign that the money is going to be better spent, that it's going to actually solve problems. And, I feel like there's another shoe to drop here.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure what it is either. And I guess, the old phrase, the devil's in the details, I think is probably very applicable here. So we'll see. With John Best talking about this week in politics, the Prime Minister would spend a fair bit of time in Ontario this week speaking with the Premier, but he was also in Kitchener earlier this week. And I want to refer to a piece in the Bay Observer, in your news thing, John, about the housing crisis, which is an ongoing crisis too. And we also heard that the Prime Minister and the Premier discussed that as well. Both governments have committed an awful lot of money to build houses. We'll see how that goes. But Ottawa is looking at a rent-to-own plan to try to ease the housing crisis. That's what you guys wrote about in the Bay Observer this week. What's your read on that?
Well, I think it's good. It was actually something that apparently was promised. When these elections are running, we hear so many promises. Apparently, this was promised during the last election, although, frankly, I don't remember it. But yeah, the idea, and it's been done before. It's not a new concept. It's the notion being that you build up some equity by renting the house, and then eventually you can flip over and actually own the house. And I guess the math behind it is that whether somebody is renting or owning a house, the value of housing tends to go up. So your equity increases as time goes on. That's more or less been the case almost forever. We do get dips as we're getting right now. We're getting some dips in the value of housing, but the general trajectory is up. So if we can get people who are gainfully employed, can afford to pay the carrying costs, but what they can't afford is to pay the rent that they're paying to live wherever they're living, and then accumulate enough money for a down payment. So it's going at that group, people that are paying rent, are housed, but simply can't accumulate the extra cash to come up with a down payment. So that's where it's aimed at. They're saying it's going to create 17,000 homes, which frankly is a drop in the bucket. If you look at Ontario, looking at adding 200,000 people, or Hamilton adding 200,000 people in the next 20 or 30 years, and Ontario adding, I think, 2 million. So I think it's a good beginning, but it's certainly not going to take a huge bite out of the housing shortage.
Yeah, I don't think there's any one thing that says, here's the solution. There's got to be a lot of stuff that's got to be thrown onto the table here. And I agree. I think it's a pretty good concept and something they should have considered a long time ago. What about those numbers, though? Both the federal and provincial governments, John, are talking about, we're going to build this. We're putting this much money aside. And that was the Prime Minister's announcement in Kitchener. Premier Ford has made similar announcements. I've talked to a number of urban planners and experts in municipal affairs, and they're skeptical. They say it's a great promise, but I don't think it's attainable. And at the same time, let's be practical about this. A lot of these quote unquote new projects or new builds are going to get jammed up at municipal councils because, as you mentioned, even in planning departments, they're understaffed now for a variety of reasons. I don't know that they can process these things faster, and there's going to be a lot of neighbors that aren't going to say, be in agreement with this. I don't want triplexes in my neighborhood, and they're going to scream to their councillor who's going to hold things up. I'm skeptical of the timelines, and I'm skeptical of the numbers that they're promising too.
Well, it's a difficult problem, and with healthcare, you're dealing with a system that has a huge government component, at least in terms of funding, and in some ways in terms of managing the system. With housing, it's 100% or 98% private developers. So it's like herding cats in a sense. You're trying to put a government solution on what is really just a very large private sector area, and really I think the main role of government in this issue is going to be getting better use out of the land that governments own. We know the city owns some land, but certainly the province of Ontario, we're told at least, owns all kinds of land that could be used for housing. How much of that is actually true? I don't know if somebody somewhere must have done an inventory of how much Ontario government owned or controlled land there is. But I think short of throwing huge amounts of cash at the issue, which is difficult because, again, you're dealing with private sector builders, and you'll start hearing complaints about subsidizing that industry. So really, I think it's the land piece where government can play a very meaningful role. Can we make better use of it? Is there fallow land around that? I think there was a chunk of land at the top of the Red Hill Expressway that once was being talked about for the stadium, back when the stadium debate was.
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure what's happened to that piece of land, but maybe that's a place where you could start. We did have a big debate about the Ontario Hospital property up behind the West Fifth facility. There was a lot of hue and cry about trying to preserve a building there, but apparently there is a fairly significant chunk of Ontario government-owned land there. I guess the question is, how much is there, and how quickly can they get it on the market so that at least we can take that piece out of the cost of housing?
Well, and it's going to also, I think, depend on the relationship between local councils and the provincial government. And to your point about the Hamilton Council, it's somewhat of an acrimonious relationship right now because of things like urban boundary, where there's a disagreement, and I'm not so sure that's going to work out. We got to leave it there. We're just about out of time. John, as always, thank you so much for this. Have a great Labor Day weekend, and we'll talk again next week.
And you, Bill. Thank you very much.
Take care. John Best, publisher of the Bay Observer.